Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 457 of For Immediate Release. I'm Shel Holtz.
And I'm Neville Hobson. Today's episode, we're going to talk about Trump's tariffs. This is a hot topic. You cannot avoid this if you turn on the TV news or pick up a newspaper, because this is a hot topic everywhere you go, anywhere in the world. So we're going to talk about this from a communicator's perspective. Now, let me set the scene. The second Trump administration, which is where we're at, Trump 2.0, has begun introducing aggressive tariff policies. These acts are already reshaping the global trade landscape. Trump has proposed across-the-board import tariffs, including a 10% levy on all foreign goods and potential increases of 60% and more on Chinese and other imports. If implemented, these acts would trigger broad economic consequences, including a high probability of retaliatory tariffs on American goods and services by affected nations. In practice, this means five things. First, rising costs for consumers and businesses. Then, disruption of global supply chains, retaliation from other countries, as I mentioned, investor uncertainty and market volatility, and geopolitical tensions and strategic risks. This isn't only a US issue. It's a global risk that requires proactive communication planning, especially for multinationals and export-heavy sectors in North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I mentioned we're looking at this from the communicator's perspective. So the question is, what must communicators do in the situation? Wherever you are, whatever you work in, particularly if it's a large enterprise and it's multinational, these are likely to be issues that concern your business, concern you as a communicator, and the people in your organization who need to do the communicating much of the time. So to help companies navigate this volatile environment, communicators have a central role to play. Strategic messaging, stakeholder reassurance, and political risk mitigation will be critical. Drawing on insights from a wide range of sources that I researched, including, in particular, I'm quoting from PR Daily, Campaign Asia, and a really interesting report from Fleischman Hillard in January, there are a number of key actions for communicators to guide their companies through an imminently volatile trade landscape. That means four key actions. First, work with professional associations for coordinated advocacy. This way you can help present unified positions on tariffs. Professional associations can effectively lobby policymakers and frame public messaging without exposing individual companies to political backlash. Second, help the C-suite focus on economic impacts, not politics. Executives should focus on how tariffs impact the business, prices, jobs, supply chains, without drifting into political commentary. This approach keeps the company above the political fray while remaining transparent and informative. Third, build agile response strategies for today's fast-moving media. Monitor emerging platforms where trade issues trend, from TikTok to Reddit. Be prepared to respond in real time. Misinformation spreads fast in politically charged conversations. And fourth, localize and align messaging tailored for each market and audience. Translate global strategies into locally resonant narratives, especially for markets where trade tensions may spark consumer or political reaction. So before we get into any kind of detail on this, let's talk about that overall picture. So Shel, how do you see this shift affecting the way companies approach public communication, especially when the policies originate in the US but have global consequences? You're in the US. How do you see it all?
Well, I think it's a crisis communication scenario for most organizations. The threat is consistent with the types of activities that lead us to invoke a crisis plan or to label it a crisis scenario. And I think those principles apply. I absolutely think that the recommendation to look to associations is a good one. What we're trying to do is protect our reputations while still advocating for the organization. And I really think there's two ways to look at this. One is, as you mentioned, professional associations. Professional associations are IABC and PRSA. For example, they represent people in professions. Then there are trade associations, which represent industries. And I think there's tremendous value in those trade associations. I remember when I worked at Allergan, a pharmaceutical company, we were a member of the American Pharmaceutical Association. It was a lobbying organization. It did other things, but it's primarily a lobbying organization. So it could go to Congress and make a lot of noise without painting a target on the backs of its members. You know, a legislator wouldn't know which member had supported a position that the trade association was taking and which opposed it. So there's a lot of value to doing that. But I also think A couple of other things that weren't mentioned in these reports. One is, you have to define what it is you want the reputation of your organization to be if you haven't already done that. And if you have done that, you need to figure out how that aligns with what's going on with these tariffs. And it's not just tariffs. I mean, let's clarify. It's also, if you look at the activities here on DEI, that's having global implications because you have global companies. You have American-based companies with European affiliates and Asian affiliates and Latin American affiliates and so on. You have internationally based companies that have a large presence in the U.S. Look at Unilever as an example. And what are the European parts of the organizations and the other non-U.S. parts of these organizations going to do around DEI? Are they going to tailor their policies outside the U.S. to accommodate what the Trump administration wants done in the U.S.? If they don't, will they provoke the ire of the administration? So this goes beyond tariffs. So identify how all of this affects your reputation and then counsel your leaders on how to talk about this. So, rather than talking about the politics, for example, talk about the economic impacts of these things. And that might keep you out of the crosshairs of the administration as they pursue these policies within individual organizations. So, yeah, and one other thing to keep in mind here is that Trump is fairly mercurial. He announces a tariff, and then 3 days later he says, well, we've had talks and I'm not going to implement the tariff. And then 3 days later, well, yes, I am. And well, it's going to be it's going to be higher, it's going to be lower. What all this means is that there is tremendous uncertainty out there. And I think uncertainty is probably the key thing that's happening as a result of all of this. So we need to be communicating with our stakeholders and especially our employees on a regular basis to let them know, look, this is where things are today. It may change tomorrow. Your leadership team is nimble and watching all of this, and we will respond appropriately based on the latest announcement out of Washington. But we also have to acknowledge the fact that we know that this could change in 24 hours or less. So I think addressing uncertainty is part of crisis communication. And one of the reasons I think crisis is the underlying approach to take to all this.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, because you mentioned this goes beyond tariffs. I don't disagree with that at all. Yet the tariff issue, you just outlined it, is full of uncertainty. Whereas things like restrictions on DEI, that's certain that has happened already. So that's unlikely to be backtracked. So you kind of know what you need to do about that. This is very different. And I think the uncertainty issue is something that spooks everyone, particularly stock markets, particularly those external groups that have a big influence on your share price if you're a listed company, on your market position, your competitive position, you name it. And so the idea of helping the C-suite, particularly senior leaders in the organization, on framing what is the messages that you're going to be consistently communicating. And you mentioned, certainly, yes, stick to the economics of it all. Don't get into the political area, even though it might be difficult to remain politics free, depending on the business you're in and where you're operating. But there are clearly opportunities, even in the time of uncertainty, where you need to be able to explain to your various stakeholder groups how tariffs, whether they're implemented, particularly if they're implemented, how they will impact your business. And that's a valid focus on prices, jobs, supply chains, all of that, as I mentioned earlier, without going into the political area. Linked to that is use language that resonates with those everyday concerns, rising costs, impact on choice, or supply delays, rather than the abstract jargon that emanates out of the political area when they're communicating stuff about tariffs. So we hear about, 10% on this, 60% on that, even 200% on wines from France, for instance, if they don't obey Trump's whims. Now, what does that actually mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that your price in your bottle of wine suddenly got by 200%. So you need to be able to help people put that in the right context for them. And that applies to employees particularly, I think. So you've got that. I think also, saying to employees, for instance, don't worry, we're on the case, we're taking care of all this. You need to explain exactly what you're doing. In that case, I would argue. So you need to assemble, the right people to respond. That's not just to communicate. You need legal, government affairs, whoever, who are ready. And this is where the role of communicators comes in, to craft and prepare timely responses to tariff announcements or inquiries from the public. So that's very reactive. And there are undoubtedly things you can do on assumptions that would stand you in good stead if you just see which way the wind seems to be blowing. This is where Trump makes it very difficult because of the fact that he's changing his mind all the time. He has said on multiple occasions that he sees this whole thing of tariffs as a negotiating tactic. But then, as you pointed out, suddenly he changed his mind. I mean, makes it very, very difficult. I think the picture's not too different if you are a business in another country outside the United States and you work for not a US-based company. You're working for a big company in your particular country that sells to various countries around the world, including to the US. Dynamic approach might be different, but I think that the issues are not that dissimilar in terms of how you need to explain this to your various stakeholder groups, what's going on. So you could argue that much of that is not really the role of communicators. In there is so much uncertainty, they can, it's not really affecting you. I would argue, yes, it is. You need to have that 360-degree view, no matter what. In a sense, with some confidence, what not to include in your communication is not really relevant to your particular situation. But it isn't going to come any easier as we get into this now, because what we've been seeing, I believe, is kind of like the first shots in the battle, where now we've got an event. And I find this extraordinary, Shel. I don't know how you see this, but the vice president and his wife are saying, we're going to go to visit Greenland on Friday. And the Greenlanders and the Danes are saying, you're not welcome. And they say, well, we're still going to go. So they're going to go no matter what. So what happens if they refuse entry? I mean, what impact is that? I'm not suggesting that should be in all your communication, but you need to be aware of potential implications for something like that. So is Trump likely to, do something crazy like invade Greenland? I mean, I don't see how that's possible. But we are in this very strange situation where truly anything is possible. I was thinking about something I saw on TV news at lunchtime today about the stock markets. All the stock markets are up big time. The major ones around the world are all up. What does that tell us about the realities of life? The cynical view for me certainly is that, well, as we know from history, in wartime, certain types of business do extremely well, and some people benefit from that. We're seeing something similar now, it seems to me. But I think communicators have an opportunity here to really demonstrate leadership in advising the C-suite in particular, but not just the C-suite, other parts of the business too, and external audiences with clarity in an uncertain environment as far as they know. And they can earn some respect for doing that, being proactive as well. And I'm sure that's happening in many companies. So what else is there, Shel, do you think that communicators could do that we've not touched on?
Quite a bit. I do want to say that, I haven't looked at the markets today, but they took quite a fall over a period of a couple of weeks. So this could be a correction too.
Yeah, probably.
Rather than a response to anything that's making them feel positive. But I also want to come back to the DEI issue just for a second, because there is tremendous uncertainty around that, not for the same reason, not because they're changing their minds, but because the executive order and the regulations that have been produced within the administration are ridiculously vague, and legal teams and HR teams are having a lot of difficulty interpreting them and deciding exactly what they need to do in order to not run afoul of them. So there's uncertainty there too. But in terms of what else communicators can do, the first thing we can do is put together response teams, assemble the teams with the various perspectives and expertise, both internal and some consultants. Where I work, we have lobbyists in each of the regions where we operate that are familiar with the governments of those regions, and would probably want to bring them into this so that they are on deck and ready when something is announced to craft a response, to make recommendations, to assess the impact. And then those rapid response protocols for those teams to use need to be developed too. What are the guidelines for really fast responses to unexpected developments? And have to incorporate the research we've already done and the scenario planning that we've done around various potential issues that could emerge. This also requires that we expand our monitoring. There may be emerging networks and platforms that people are using to discuss this and share information, identify those and incorporate them into your media monitoring mix. Might even pay off. Your leaders are very busy people. They're running the organization. Yes, they're getting the news and they have groups that they're part of that share the news, but it's still sort of cherry picked. It might be worthwhile if you could do this. And here's an opportunity to put generative AI to work to do a daily summary of where things are at on these issues. What are the latest executive orders? What are the latest changes that the administration has made to previously announced actions? What are the reactions from various countries and other stakeholders? What are the impacts that are being reported in various industries, especially your own? And just a daily bullet point summary that says this is where we're at to help guide them in their decision making. But again, I think the primary thing is what do we want our reputation to be during all of this? And then how do we couch the communication, the messaging that we are delivering in response to this in order to reinforce that reputation and to avoid getting engaged in divisive political arguments, which wouldn't be beneficial for most organizations?
Yeah, that's sound advice, I think. And I would just simply add to that this applies wherever you are in the world. If you're in Europe or in Asia, it doesn't make any difference, that you would do this as it relates to the relevance of your organization, the country you're in. I think the other bit to mention is if you're working for a global company, whether it's American or any other, you could also perform a really valuable service to others by translating global approaches that affect your business on a global level into locally resonant narratives that apply in that particular country you're in, or if you're responsible for communication in a number of countries, to tailor it to help you communicate effectively in those other countries too, and in the languages too. So there may be different trade tensions in some of those other countries, which is likely to be the case. This is not all very uniform. What we've been seeing about 10% of this and 60% of that, it may be different in particular countries, particularly smaller ones, but the effects are likely to be resonating around the world. And some of the things that are very hard to predict indeed is exactly what and where. So hence that adds uncertainty to the broader uncertainty about what all of this means. So opportunity for communicators, I think, is how I summarize all of that, Shel. In very uncertain times, this is a moment to shine, if you will. Even if what you're doing is not kind of like headline making, it's valuable to those you serve in the organization in terms of the intelligence you give them that enables them to confidently talk about these issues. So that's what you need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And listeners, we would love to know how you are handling all of this in your organizations, both within the U.S. and outside the U.S. How are you counseling your leaders? What kinds of messages are you sending to employees? What kinds of teams have you assembled? We would love to report on that. If you would rather we don't mention your name or your organization, that's fine. We don't need to. Just the case studies would be an amazing follow-up. And that will be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.